The slam of the kitchen cabinet echoed through the cramped house like a gunshot. "You should be grateful we even let you sleep here." My stepmother's voice sliced through the air, her lips curling into that venomous half-smile she always wore when she wanted me to break. "No one wants you, Ava. Not your father, not us, not anyone." Before we begin, drop a comment and tell us where are you from and from which city you're watching our videos. And after watching the whole video, don't forget to tell us. What would you do in this situation? Be honest. Tell me in the comments below. We read every comment. Let's begin. My fingers froze on the chipped countertop, the mug in my hand trembling so hard that the coffee rippled over the edge and scorched my skin. I didn't even flinch, not because it didn't hurt, but because I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me react. From the corner of the kitchen, my stepsister Brooke leaned against the doorway, arms crossed over her designer hoodie, eyes sparkling with cruel amusement. "Don't worry, Mom," she said sweetly. "She'll be gone soon enough. People like her never last." I met her gaze, calm on the outside, while inside my chest a storm raged. They didn't know I'd been up since 4 a.m., working my shift at the diner, scrubbing floors until my knees ached, just to keep enough cash to buy groceries for myself. They didn't care. My stepmother, Sharon, stepped closer, her perfume cloying, expensive, the kind that felt like it didn't belong anywhere near someone like me. She tilted her head, mock concern dripping from her voice. "Honey, maybe it's time you accepted reality. You're 25, living under someone else's roof, working dead-end jobs. If I were you, I'd be embarrassed." Something in my stomach tightened, but I swallowed it down. I'd learned the hard way that arguing with her was like throwing gasoline on an already raging fire. She thrived on control, on making me feel small. But today, something inside me whispered, "Not much longer." Before I could respond, Brooke smirked. "Oh, and Ava, there's laundry piling up in the hallway, and you left your shoes by the door again. We're not your maids." I placed the mug in the sink and turned toward the hallway without a word. My silence seemed to frustrate them more than anything I could say. But as I climbed the narrow staircase to the small guest room I'd been banished to, my mind wasn't on the laundry or the shoes. It was on the email I'd received at 2 a.m., the one that could change everything. By morning, they'd see me differently. The next morning, the house was unusually quiet. Sharon and Brooke were in the living room, sipping coffee, scrolling on their phones, completely ignoring me as I walked toward the front door. That's when I heard it, the deep, low hum of an engine pulling up outside. Through the thin curtains, a sleek black sedan glided to a stop at the curb. Not just any car. This thing looked like it belonged to someone who never had to check their bank account before making a purchase. Sharon's voice floated over, sharp and suspicious. "Expecting someone, Ava? Or is it another one of your little job interviews?" I ignored her and stepped outside. The driver's door opened, and a man in a dark suit stepped out, his posture crisp, his expression unreadable. Without a word, he approached me, opened a leather briefcase, and handed me a thick envelope, heavy in my palm. Sharon appeared in the doorway, Brooke right behind her. "What is that?" she demanded. I didn't answer. My fingers slid under the seal, and as I pulled out the contents, Sharon's sharp inhale filled the air. She saw the letterhead first, and her face drained of color. Her coffee cup slipped from her hand, shattering on the porch. She took a shaky step forward. "Ava, what is this?" The driver stood still, his hands clasped in front of him like a shadow. I let my eyes meet Sharon's, and for the first time in years, I smiled. Cold, steady. "You'll find out soon enough," I said. And then, she dropped to her knees. Sharon's knees hit the porch with a dull thud, the sound almost drowned out by the thumping in my ears. Brooke stood frozen behind her, eyes darting from me to the envelope, like she was trying to calculate just how badly her morning had shifted. "Ava!" Sharon's voice was softer now, stripped of the acid it usually carried. Where did you get this?" I let the silence stretch. The wind tugged at my hair, the sun catching on the embossed gold letters of the document I held, the seal glimmering like something holy, though there was nothing divine about what was coming. The driver stood a few feet away, deliberately impassive, his sunglasses reflecting the whole pathetic tableau. The queen bee on her knees, her spoiled daughter hovering like a frightened shadow, and me, silent, holding the one thing that could flip this house upside down. You need to explain yourself right now. Brooke's voice cracked like a whip. Her faux confidence was already fraying. Is this some scam? Did you steal something? I turned my head slowly toward her, my smile still faint but sharper now. You think I'd risk prison for this? I lifted the papers slightly, letting them see the thick bundle of legal documents and the small velvet box resting on top. Sharon's gaze locked on the box, her mouth opening and closing like she'd forgotten how to form words. No. No, this can't. I stepped past her and walked back inside, my shoes clicking against the worn hardwood floors. They followed like I was leading them into some kind of trial. At the kitchen table, I placed the velvet box down first. Open it, I said quietly. Brooke hesitated, then reached for it. The moment her fingers brushed the fabric, I saw it. The same greed in her eyes. I'd seen every Christmas, every birthday, whenever there was even the faintest hint of something expensive in the room. She flipped the lid. Inside, nestled against black satin, was a key. A small silver key engraved with a single word, penthouse. Sharon's hand flew to her mouth. Brooke looked at me like I'd just pulled a rabbit out of thin air. What is this supposed to mean? She demanded. Some Airbnb? A joke? I set the papers in front of Sharon. She didn't reach for them. She just stared at the seal, recognition dawning, panic threading into her breathing. These, I said, tapping the top page, are the deed transfer papers for the Hamilton Tower penthouse downtown. You know, the one you've been talking about for years. The one you told everyone at your wine club you'd buy when the time was right. Sharon's eyes snapped up to mine. That's not possible. That unit's mine now, I finished for her. My voice didn't raise. It didn't need to. The weight of the words did the work. The driver cleared his throat. Miss Ava, he said, the car is ready to take you whenever you're ready to see the property. Sharon's composure cracked entirely. Ava, you can't just walk out of here with, I'm not walking out, I said, standing. I'm leaving, and I'm not coming back. Her face blanched. Brooke's mouth hung open. And for the first time since I'd been forced under this roof, I felt the air shift in my lungs, lighter, freer, charged with something dangerously close to joy. But this wasn't the end, not even close, because I hadn't told them how I got it, or what else was coming. The car door shut behind me with a heavy, satisfying click, muffling Sharon's frantic voice as she shouted my name from the porch. I didn't turn back. The driver slid behind the wheel, the leather interior smelling faintly of cedar and something expensive I couldn't place. We pulled away slowly, the quiet hum of the engine a stark contrast to the chaos I'd just left behind. My reflection in the tinted glass stared back at me, calm on the surface, but underneath, every nerve was burning. It had taken months to get here, months of silence, of swallowing my pride, of letting them think they'd broken me. Months of working double shifts, of meeting in quiet corners of coffee shops, of signing my name to documents that didn't make sense until the last piece fell into place. The driver's voice cut through my thoughts. Miss Ava, Mr. Caldwell asked me to deliver the rest of the package once we arrived. My stomach tightened, not with fear, but with the electric thrill of knowing exactly what that meant. We'll go there now, I said. The penthouse sat 30 stories above the city, glass and steel reflecting the morning sun like a crown. As the elevator doors opened, I stepped into a world so far removed from the chipped paint and musty carpets of Sharon's house, it might as well have been another planet. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the open living space, the skyline sprawling beyond them. On the marble kitchen island lay a black folder. The driver set it in front of me and stepped back. Inside, along with final ownership documents, was a letter. My pulse quickened as I recognized the handwriting. Firm, precise. Ava, you earned this long before I met you. I've simply given you the platform you deserve. Do with it what you will. DC, I traced the initials with my thumb. Daniel Caldwell. I'd met Daniel 6 months ago, purely by accident, or so I thought. He'd come into the diner one night, alone, quiet, wearing a suit that made the neon lights above our cracked counter look cheap. His order was simple: black coffee, no sugar, no cream. But his eyes lingered on me longer than most customers dared. When he left, he tipped more than my weekly paycheck. The next night, he came back. And the next. Slowly, between bites of pie and sips of coffee, I told him pieces of my life. Not all, but enough for him to understand why I kept my guard up. And in return, he told me about people he used to know, people who use their power to crush others, people like Sharon. I didn't know then that he was one of the wealthiest men in the city, or that he'd already started digging into my stepmother's world the moment I told him her name. The driver cleared his throat again, bringing me back to the present. "There's more," he said. From his briefcase, he handed me a small flash drive. "Mr. Caldwell thought you might appreciate this." "What's on it?" I asked, though I already felt my skin prickle. "Security footage," he replied, "from your home." The past 3 months I stared at the drive, my fingers curling around it. If Daniel had gotten his hands on that footage, it meant one thing. Sharon's secrets weren't just whispers anymore. They were evidence, and I knew exactly how to use them. By the time I returned to the car, the city felt different. Bigger. My chest felt different too. Not because I'd escaped Sharon's roof, but because I finally had the kind of leverage you can't buy back once it's out in the open. She thought this morning had broken her. She had no idea what was coming tomorrow. By the time I returned to Sharon's street the next morning, word had already begun to spread. 2 neighbors were out front, pretending to trim hedges while openly staring at the sleek black car gliding toward the curb. I saw curtains twitch, phones in hands, mouths moving in quick whispers. Sharon always loved being the center of attention. Today she was about to get it in a way she'd never wanted. The driver parked with deliberate precision. I stepped out, heels clicking against the cracked driveway. My heart was steady, not racing, because the fear was gone now. All that was left was control. Sharon was on the porch, arms folded, Brooke standing a few feet behind her like a nervous shadow. The air between them was tight, brittle. Sharon's hair was perfect, makeup layered heavy to hide the sleepless night I knew she'd had. "You've got some nerve showing up here," she said, voice loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "I don't know what scam you've pulled, Ava, but it ends now." "Scam?" I tilted my head, a small smile tugging at my lips. "You might want to be careful using that word, considering what's on this." I held up the flash drive. Brooke's brow furrowed. Sharon's mask didn't slip. Yet. But the slight stiffening of her posture told me she recognized the danger. I walked up the steps slowly, deliberately. "This little thing holds 3 months' worth of footage from inside this house, from the cameras you didn't know existed." Brooke laughed once, brittle and high-pitched. "Please, what could you possibly— Want me to start with the audio?" I cut her off. My voice stayed low, but the words carried like they were made of glass ready to shatter. "The recordings of you telling Dad that you'd make sure I never saw a cent of his savings? Or maybe the one where Sharon told the insurance adjuster that he'd been too sick to sign the forms, while you used his signature anyway." Sharon's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her eyes flicked toward the neighbors. I could almost see the calculation in her head, whether to try to shout me down or drag me inside before I could say more. But she stayed frozen. I stepped even closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear. "And then there's the video, Sharon. The one where you told Brooke to accidentally spill wine on my laptop because you thought I had job applications saved there." Her breath hitched, small, but I heard it. And in that moment, I knew she was picturing the fallout. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, voice trembling for the first time since I'd known her. "Because," I said, straightening, "you made sure I never had a home here, and now I'm making sure you never have the standing you've used to look down on me." I turned to the driver, who handed me a sealed manila envelope. I dropped it onto the porch at her feet. Inside were printed still frames from the footage. Clear, undeniable. "By the end of today, this goes to the board at Dad's company. By tomorrow, the lawyer has it. And by the end of the week," I paused, letting the silence hang, "you'll be lucky if the only thing you lose is this house." Brooke's face had gone pale. Sharon's knees wavered again, the same way they had when I opened that envelope yesterday. But this time, she didn't fall. She just stood there, breathing shallow, eyes locked on me, understanding fully that she had nothing left to say. I stepped back toward the car, but before I got in, I turned one last time. "Oh, and Sharon, you told me no one wanted me." I let the words sink in, slow and deliberate. "Funny thing is, there's a long list of people who want to see you gone." And with that, I left her standing on that porch, surrounded by neighbors who had heard enough to start tearing her reputation apart before dinner. By evening, the city felt electric. The sun had dipped low, painting the skyline in burnt orange and deep blue. But my phone hadn't stopped vibrating all afternoon. Messages, missed calls, voicemails, all from people I hadn't heard from in years, and all of them saying the same thing. Ava, you need to see this. I already knew what this was. The footage was out. Daniel had handled it personally, making sure every piece landed exactly where it would cut deepest. Dad's old company board, Sharon's bridge club, the insurance investigator she thought she'd charmed into ignoring the inconsistencies. By 7 p.m., Sharon's name was circulating through group chats and whispered phone calls like a scandal you couldn't look away from. I didn't plan to go back. Not tonight. But when Daniel called and said, "They're unraveling. If you want your closure, this is the moment," I knew he was right. The car pulled up once again to the house that had never felt like mine. This time, the porch light was off. The curtains were drawn. But I could see movement inside, shadows pacing, frantic. I didn't knock. I walked straight in. Sharon was in the living room, still in the same clothes from this morning, makeup smudged, her phone clutched in one hand like it could save her. Brooke sat on the couch, knees pulled to her chest, scrolling through her phone as if sheer denial could shield her from reality. They both froze when they saw me. "You..." Sharon's voice cracked, raw from hours of talking, or crying. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" I stepped closer, slow, deliberate. "I took the power you stole from me, and I made sure everyone knew who you really are." Brooke shot to her feet. "You ruined us," she spat. "We're finished because of you." I tilted my head. "Finished? No, Brooke. Finished is what you tried to make me when you laughed at me in the kitchen, when you ruined my laptop, when you told me I'd never matter. This is just justice." Sharon's shoulders slumped, her voice dropping to a whisper. "What do you want, Ava? Money? The house? To humiliate me more?" I studied her for a long moment. Her voice had lost that cutting edge, the superiority that had once felt unshakable. And I realized something important. I didn't need more. I already had what mattered. "I don't want your house," I said, my tone calm but firm. "I have my own. I don't want your money. I've earned more than you think. And I don't want to humiliate you further, because you'll do that all on your own." Her eyes flickered with confusion. "Then, why?" I stepped closer, leaning in just enough for her to hear me over the thundering quiet of the room. "Because," I said, "every time you look in the mirror, I want you to remember that the girl you said no one wanted now has everything you thought you could take from her, and you'll never get it back." I left without waiting for her reply. Outside, the night air was sharp and clean. Daniel was leaning against the black sedan, watching me with that steady, knowing gaze. "How does it feel?" he asked. I took a deep breath. The weight I'd carried for years, the quiet shame, the exhaustion from constantly defending my worth, was gone. "Like I can finally breathe," I said. He nodded once, opening the car door for me. As we pulled away, I didn't look back at the house. I didn't need to. That chapter was closed, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving. I was free. The sound of metal scraping against concrete was all I could hear. My gloves were thin, torn at the fingertips, and the weight of the toolbox nearly split my arms in half. I was crouched in the driveway, grease streaked across my cheek, when his voice cut through the humid air like a whip. "Doing manual labor? That's what you've become? Before we begin, drop a comment and tell us where are you from, and from which city you're watching our videos. And after watching the whole video, don't forget to tell us what would you do in this situation. Be honest. Tell me in the comments below." We read every comment. Let's begin. Every muscle in my back froze. My father's tone wasn't just disapproval, it was contempt, laced with the smug delight of someone who thought they'd caught you at your lowest. I looked up and saw him standing there at the edge of the crowd. Because yes, there was a crowd. My entire extended family, neighbors, a couple of his golf buddies. Apparently, everyone had gathered for a mid-afternoon barbecue in the yard. And there I was, kneeling in the gravel, sleeves rolled up, a wrench in my hand. "You've shamed this family," he boomed, gesturing toward me like I was a bad joke on display. A ripple of laughter spread through the group. I caught my sister's smirk, that slow, knowing curl of her lips that always said she was enjoying every second of my humiliation. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to breathe evenly, not because I didn't care, I cared more than I wanted to admit, but because I'd learned a long time ago that if you gave them a reaction, they'd take it and rip it apart. I set the wrench down slowly, like I had all the time in the world. My palms burned from gripping it too tightly. The summer air was thick with the smell of grilled meat and gasoline, but all I could taste was the bitterness rising in my throat. He stepped closer, making sure everyone could hear. This is what happens when you throw away your degree, when you think you're smarter than the people who raised you. Look at her, elbow deep in grease, living in some rundown apartment, and that's when a deeper, slower voice cut through his rant. That's enough, Henry. All heads turned. My grandfather, a man who rarely spoke more than a handful of words in any given week, was pushing himself up from his chair. His hands shook slightly from age, but his back was straight, and his gaze locked on my father like a marksman. There was a quiet tension, the kind that freezes even the wind. My father's smug grin faltered, just a fraction. Grandpa stepped forward, each movement deliberate, his walking cane tapping against the patio bricks like a gavel. When he stopped beside me, he didn't look down at my stained shirt or the dirt under my nails. He looked at my father. "If you think this is shame," Grandpa said, his voice slow but razor sharp, "then maybe it's time I tell them what you did 30 years ago." The air seemed to thicken. Conversations died mid-sentence. My aunt's hand froze halfway to her mouth, holding a glass of iced tea. My father's jaw tightened. "Don't start, Dad." But Grandpa wasn't hearing him. He turned to the crowd, his voice gaining strength with every word. "You want to talk about shame? Let's talk about the night you almost destroyed this family. The night you swore me to silence." A murmur swept through the guests. My pulse pounded in my ears. For years, I'd suspected my father was hiding something. But the way his face drained of color told me this wasn't just a petty secret. This was a loaded weapon Grandpa had kept holstered for decades. And now, he was aiming. Grandpa's voice didn't shake. It carried low and deliberate, like he'd been waiting 3 decades to say these words out loud. 30 years ago, Henry," he began, eyes locked on my father, "you stood in this very yard and pretended to be the golden son. But that night, you almost ruined everything your mother and I worked for." People shifted in their chairs. Even the kids stopped fidgeting. My father's hand tightened around his glass until his knuckles turned white. "Dad, quiet." The single word hit harder than a slap. Grandpa leaned slightly on his cane, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "It was the summer of '94. Your father," he jabbed the air toward my dad, "was entrusted with $30,000. Not his money, mind you. Company funds. Money that didn't belong to him. And do you know what he did?" No one breathed. "He gambled it away." A collective gasp rose from the group. My aunt's face went pale. One of my father's friends nearly choked on his drink. Grandpa continued, his words slicing through the thick silence. "He didn't just lose it. He lied to everyone. He told his mother he'd been robbed. He told me it was an investment gone bad. He begged me not to call the police because it would destroy the family name." He turned to face my father fully. "You remember that night, Henry? You remember me selling my own truck, draining my savings, just so you wouldn't go to prison?" The air was electric now, heavy with the weight of truth. My father's lips tightened, but his eyes darted toward the guests like he was calculating how bad this was. I stood there, frozen, my hands still smeared with grease, my heartbeat slamming in my chest. For so many years, he'd stood above me, judging me, belittling me, and all along, he'd been hiding this. Grandpa wasn't finished. "You call her shameful for working with her hands? She's earning an honest living. She's not lying, cheating, or stealing. She's not dragging our name through the mud and letting her father take the fall." The words felt like fire in the air. My sister's smirk had vanished. She looked between Grandpa and Dad, like she didn't recognize either of them. My father took a step forward, voice low but sharp. "You're dredging up ancient history to protect her? She's not a victim, Dad. She's a disappointment." Grandpa's cane slammed against the ground, the sound echoing through the yard. "The only disappointment here is a man who never took responsibility for the damage he caused." His eyes softened when he turned to me. "And you don't owe anyone here an ounce of shame." My throat tightened. I wanted to speak, to thank him, but the lump in my chest was too heavy. Around us, whispers spread like wildfire. I could feel the shift happening. The way people were looking at me differently now, and at him, with suspicion, with judgment. And deep inside, beneath the shock and the humiliation, something sharp began to take root. It wasn't just relief, it was resolve. Because for the first time, I realized my father's power over me had just cracked, and I was going to shatter it completely. I stood there in the gravel, the taste of iron in my mouth, my gloves dangling from my fingers. The murmur of voices swelled around me, a low current of disbelief and curiosity, like a storm building just beyond the horizon. For years, my father had orchestrated these little performances, moments where he could pull the spotlight, point it squarely at me, and make sure everyone saw the version of me he wanted them to see: lazy, directionless, pathetic, the girl who wasted her degree and embarrassed the family. But now, that script had been ripped clean in half. I glanced at my sister. She was pale, her hands gripping her glass so tight the condensation had made a perfect ring around her thumb. My mother sat rigid in her chair, jaw clenched, not daring to interrupt Grandpa's rare fury. Even his golf buddies, the ones who always laughed at Dad's cheap little jokes about me, were silent, staring at him like they were seeing the man for the first time. And him? My father's composure was cracking. I could see it in the slight tremor in his jaw, the way his tongue darted out to wet his lips before he spoke. He tried to laugh it off, a short, sharp sound. This is ridiculous. 30 years ago, I was a kid. Everyone makes mistakes. Grandpa didn't flinch. A kid? His voice was ice. You were 24 years old. You were married. You had a child on the way. His gaze flicked to me for just a second, enough to make my chest constrict. And instead of preparing for her future, you were sneaking out at night, handing over other people's money to strangers across a blackjack table. A ripple of gasps moved through the crowd. My aunt set down her glass so hard it clinked against the table. Dad's eyes darted toward me then, sharp and calculating, like I was suddenly a threat. And for the first time in my life, I liked that. I felt the weight of everyone's stares shift in my direction, and I knew this was my moment. The first moment I had ever had in this family where I could decide how the story would be told. I stepped forward, wiping my hands on the rag stuffed in my pocket. So, let me get this straight, I said, keeping my voice calm, steady, almost casual. You've spent my entire life telling me I'm a failure because I don't live up to your standards. And all this time, your standard was not getting caught? A few chuckles escaped from the group, quick and awkward, like people weren't sure if it was safe to laugh. My father's eyes narrowed. Watch your mouth! But something in me had shifted, and I couldn't stop. No, I think I've watched it long enough. I've watched it when you cut me down at family dinners. I've watched it when you made jokes about my odd jobs, like they were something to be ashamed of. And I've watched it while you've conveniently left out the part where you nearly destroyed Grandpa's business. His face darkened, the veins in his temple standing out. You think you're clever now, do you? Riding on his protection? I tilted my head, feigning thoughtfulness. Number. I think I'm just tired of being quiet. Grandpa laid a hand on my shoulder. Steady, solid. You don't need to explain yourself to him. He's had 30 years to fix his reputation. You've had 30 seconds to show more courage than he ever has. That line landed. I could feel it in the way the air changed. People weren't just looking at me differently now. They were looking at him like they finally saw the cracks. He tried one last jab. Well, if you think working with your hands is so noble, maybe you should keep doing it while the rest of us handle real success. I smiled then. Not the nervous, tight smile I usually wore when he took shots at me, but something slower, sharper. Oh, don't worry, Dad. I plan on working with my hands for a while longer. Just not the way you think. Because what he didn't know, what no one here knew, was that I had something of my own tucked away. Something that could take that crack in his reputation and split it wide open. And now that the first blow had landed, I wasn't going to stop until the whole facade came crashing down. The crowd eventually began to scatter, but the damage was done. Conversations stayed hushed, glances kept darting toward my father like they were replaying every interaction they'd ever had with him. I didn't stick around to watch him try to salvage his image. I slipped out through the side gate, the heat from the driveway rising up against my legs, my boots crunching over gravel as I headed toward my truck. My gloves were still balled in my pocket, my palms sweating from more than just the weather. The humiliation I'd carried for years had shifted into something heavier and sharper. It was no longer about surviving his constant criticism, it was about ending it. And I already had the first thread to pull. 3 months ago, I'd been cleaning out an old storage unit I'd rented when I first moved out. Buried in one of the boxes marked kitchen stuff was a battered manila envelope with my father's handwriting on it. At first, I thought it was some old tax paperwork he'd tossed in my stuff by accident, but when I opened it, my stomach dropped. It wasn't just tax forms. It was letters, receipts, a handful of legal notices, all with the same law firm's name printed across the top, all dated between 1994 and 1996. And they weren't for my father. They were for a man named Ethan Carter. The name meant nothing to me at first, until I saw one of the notices listing aliases. My father's name was printed there. It hit me like a punch. Back when Grandpa bailed him out, my father hadn't just been gambling. He'd been operating under a fake identity. There was a whole other layer to the story Grandpa told today, one my father clearly thought was buried forever. The thing was, I'd already done some digging. A quiet afternoon at the county records office, a few polite questions to the right clerk, and I'd discovered something else. Ethan Carter had been involved in a property deal that fell apart in a way that looked very familiar. Money gone, promises broken, and the last document in that envelope, a letter from the state's Department of Justice marked case closed, evidence insufficient. It was more than enough to make him sweat if it ever saw daylight. As I drove away from the house, I could still hear my grandfather's voice in my head. You don't owe anyone here an ounce of shame. Maybe not, but I could give someone else a healthy serving of it. I started with the obvious, a call to Maggie, an old family acquaintance who'd worked in real estate for decades and had no love for my father. She answered on the second ring. Thought you swore you'd never call me again, she said, voice dry but tinged with curiosity. I changed my mind, I replied. I need everything you can find on a property deal from 1995, the name Ethan Carter. There was a pause. That's oddly specific. It's worth your while, I said. Trust me. By the time I got home that night, she'd already texted me a single sentence. You're not going to believe who else was involved. And when I opened the file she'd attached, I felt the first real smile of the day tug at my mouth. Because not only was my father tied to the deal, so was one of his closest friends. The same friend who was standing in that yard today, laughing when my father called me a shame to the family. Now it wasn't just revenge, it was strategy. The next week was a blur of late-night calls, quiet meetings, and a kind of focus I hadn't felt in years. Every piece of evidence Maggie sent over fit perfectly into the puzzle I was building. Old contracts, sworn statements, bank transfers that looked clean at first glance, but carried the stink of backroom. Deals. The picture was damning. And the more I dug, the more I realized how carefully my father had managed to craft his respectable businessman persona. It was a mask he wore so well that people never thought to look underneath. But now, I had enough to rip it off in one clean motion. The timing was everything. My opportunity came faster than I expected. My cousin's engagement party was set for Saturday evening, a sprawling outdoor affair in the same backyard where my father had humiliated me just a week earlier. Invitations had gone out months ago. My father was set to give a family toast after dinner, something he loved because it put him squarely at the center of attention. Perfect. I arrived late, deliberately. I didn't want idle chit-chat. I wanted to walk in at the right moment. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the yard was already buzzing. Strings of warm lights hung over tables, people laughed over plates of food, and the hum of conversation was punctuated by bursts of music from the rented speakers. I slipped in through the side gate again, just as my father stepped up to the microphone. He looked perfectly at ease, drink in hand, smile polished for the crowd. Family, he began, voice smooth, is about holding each other to a standard, about protecting our name, our legacy. I stepped forward. Loud enough to cut through his sentence, I said, Is that what you call what you did in '94, Dad? The mic caught it. The speakers carried it. Conversation stopped like someone had hit pause. He blinked, the smile flickering. This isn't the time. No, I think it's exactly the time. My voice didn't shake. I walked up beside him, my boots crunching against the patio. Last week, Grandpa reminded everyone about the $30,000 you gambled away. But he didn't mention the rest, did he? A ripple of unease went through the crowd. My grandfather, seated at the front table, watched me with the same steady expression he'd had last week, not interfering, but not looking away either. I pulled a folded document from my bag and laid it on the table in front of the mic. This is the state record of a failed property deal. Ethan Carter was the name on the contract. And here's the list of aliases the DOJ has on file. I tapped the paper. Funny thing, Dad, your name is right here. The friend who'd been laughing the loudest at my expense last week shifted in his chair. You should be careful. Oh, you're in it too, I said without missing a beat. I turned the second page toward the crowd. Co-signed by you, 2 men promising land to investors that never materialized. Money went missing. No charges, thanks to insufficient evidence. I looked at my father. Guess Grandpa bailed you out twice. The silence was suffocating. My mother's eyes were wide. My sister's face was ghostly. People weren't just looking at him differently now. They were looking at him like he was radioactive. He grabbed the mic, voice low and furious. You have no idea what you're talking about. Really? I took the mic back, my voice steady. Because I've got every document, every bank transfer, every letter. I've got statements from 2 people who were there that year, and if anyone here wants copies, I'll be happy to email them tonight. Someone in the back actually clapped, one sharp, startling sound. And it broke the tension just enough for whispers to explode around the yard. I didn't look at him as I stepped back. You wanted to call me a shame to this family? Fine. But now they know exactly what kind of man gets to decide that. Grandpa rose slowly from his chair and walked over. He didn't speak to me right away, just placed his hand on my shoulder, the same way he had last week. Then he turned to the crowd. I think we've heard enough speeches for one night, he said simply. Let's enjoy the party. And just like that, the center of attention shifted, away from my father, away from his carefully guarded image. The conversations that started back up weren't about the engagement anymore. They were about him. By the time I left, I didn't need to say another word. The damage was permanent, and I hadn't even released the documents yet. I slid behind the wheel of my truck, the warm hum of the party fading behind me. For the first time in years, I felt light. Not because I'd embarrassed him. That was just a side effect. No, it was because I'd taken back the power he'd stolen from me, piece by piece over a lifetime. And I knew, deep down, he'd never be able to take it again.